My name is Daniel Reeves. I'm 34, a staff sergeant with the Army Rangers. And I came home early for Christmas, believing that after everything I'd survived overseas, my wife would still be there. She wasn't. The house was empty, locked from the inside with the spare key missing from under the mat where we'd kept it for 6 years. And when I finally got the door open with the tools from my truck, I found a note on the kitchen counter that told me everything I needed to know about what our marriage had become. She'd left 3 days earlier. She said she needed time to think. She said the holidays were stressful and she'd gone to stay with her sister in Portland for a week, maybe 2. She said she'd call when she was ready. What she didn't say was that she knew I was coming home, that I'd told her the exact date 2 weeks ago during our last phone call, that Christmas Eve was in 4 days and she'd chosen to be anywhere but here. The house felt wrong in ways that had nothing to do with being empty. The refrigerator was almost bare. The trash hadn't been taken out in days. The mail was piled on the dining room table in a heap that suggested she'd stopped opening it sometime in November. I walked through each room looking for signs of what had happened, but there was nothing dramatic, no evidence of crisis or catastrophe. It was worse than that. It was the accumulation of small abandonments, the kind that happen when someone stops caring whether you notice. I'd been deployed for 11 months, Afghanistan mostly. Mountain operations, training local forces, the kind of work that doesn't make the news but still gets people killed if you're not careful. I'd called when I could, written emails when the internet worked, sent packages with the things she said she wanted. She'd responded, but looking back now, I could see how her messages had changed over time. They'd gotten shorter, more general, the kind of thing you'd write to someone you barely knew. I sat down at the kitchen table and read the note again. Her handwriting was the same as always, neat and careful, the letters perfectly formed. She'd used the good stationery, the cream-colored paper we'd bought for thank-you cards after the wedding. That detail bothered me more than anything else in the note. It suggested planning, preparation. She'd known what she was going to do, and she'd made sure to do it properly. I called her cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. I called her sister's house in Portland. No answer. I tried her mother, her best friend, the yoga studio where she taught 3 days a week. Nothing. No one had seen her. No one knew where she was. Or if they did, they weren't telling me. The sun was setting by the time I gave up trying to reach her. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window watching the neighbors' houses light up one by one. The Hendersons had put up their Christmas decorations, the white lights they used every year wrapped around their porch railings. The Martins had a wreath on their door. Our house was dark. We'd never gotten around to decorations this year, or last year, or the year before that. I thought about my father. He lived 40 minutes south in a town I hadn't visited in almost a year. We talked on the phone sometimes, but not often. He'd remarried after my mother died, and his new wife kept him busy with projects around the house and trips to see her grandchildren in California. I should have called him when I landed at Fort Lewis that morning. Should have let him know I was home, but I'd wanted to surprise Sarah first. I'd wanted to believe that coming home meant something. The last time I'd seen my father was Easter Sunday 7 months ago. He'd looked good then, healthy and strong for a man in his 60s. Sarah hadn't wanted to go to the dinner he'd invited us to, said she had papers to grade and lesson plans to finish. I'd gone alone. We'd eaten ham and talked about the news and avoided mentioning the things that mattered. He hadn't asked about Sarah. I hadn't volunteered anything. That should have told me something. I found my phone and pulled up his number. It rang 4 times before he answered. His voice sounded tired, rough around the edges in a way that wasn't normal. I told him I was home. I told him Sarah wasn't here. There was a pause, long enough that I thought the connection had dropped. And then he said something that changed everything. He said he'd been trying to reach me for weeks. He said he'd sent emails, left voicemails, even tried calling the base to get a message through. He said he needed to talk to me about something important, something he couldn't explain over the phone. He said he'd been sick. Really sick. The kind of sick that required doctors and tests and treatment plans. He said he'd tried to tell Sarah, thought maybe she could pass the message along. But every time he called the house, she said she'd let me know, and then nothing happened. I listened to him talk and felt something cold settle in my chest. I asked him when he'd first tried to reach me. He said August. I asked him how many times he'd called the house. He said at least a dozen, maybe more. I asked him what Sarah had told him. He said she'd been sympathetic, said I was busy with important work, said she'd make sure I called him back. But I never got those messages. Not one. I told him I'd be there in the morning. I told him we'd figure out whatever needed to be figured out. I told him I was sorry, even though I didn't know yet what I was apologizing for. When I hung up, the house felt even emptier than before. The note on the counter seemed smaller now, less significant. Sarah had left because she wanted time to think, but my father had been trying to reach me for months, while she stood between us and said nothing. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in the bed we'd shared for 8 years, and stared at the ceiling and thought about all the ways a person can betray someone without ever raising their voice or throwing a punch. I thought about my father calling the house, maybe worried, maybe scared, asking my wife to pass along a message that I never received. I thought about her standing in this kitchen, holding the phone, making promises she never intended to keep. And I thought about how she'd timed her departure so carefully, leaving just before I came home, avoiding the confrontation, avoiding the questions, avoiding me. By the time the sun came up on December 21st, I knew that the marriage was over. Not because she'd left. Not even because she'd lied, but because when someone needs you and you're not there, and the person who could have connected you chooses not to, that's not a mistake. That's a decision. And some decisions can't be forgiven. I drove to my father's house at dawn. The roads were clear, and the sky was that particular shade of gray that happens in the Pacific Northwest in December, heavy with clouds that never quite commit to rain. The radio was playing Christmas music, songs about family and homecoming and joy, and I turned it off after the first verse. He lived in a small ranch house at the end of a cul-de-sac, the kind of neighborhood where people kept their lawns neat and their cars in the garage, and nobody bothered anyone else unless something was actually wrong. I'd grown up 3 miles from here, in a different house that my mother had sold after the divorce. This place had never felt like home to me, but my father had lived here with Linda for 5 years now, and they'd made it theirs. Linda answered the door. She was a small woman in her late 50s, gray-haired and practical, the kind of person who kept emergency supplies in the garage and remembered everyone's birthday. She looked at me for a moment without saying anything, and I saw something in her face that I didn't want to see. Pity, maybe. Or sadness. She stepped back and let me in. My father was sitting in his recliner in the living room. The television was on but muted, showing some morning talk show with people laughing about something I couldn't hear. He looked smaller than I remembered. Thinner. His face had that gray quality that comes from being too tired for too long. When he saw me, he tried to stand up, but Linda put a hand on his shoulder and shook her head, so he stayed where he was. I sat down on the couch across from him. Linda brought coffee and then disappeared into the back of the house, giving us space. For a minute, neither of us said anything. The clock on the mantel ticked. Outside, someone was running a leaf blower, the sound distant and mechanical. He told me about the diagnosis. Pancreatic cancer, stage 3. They'd found it in August after he'd gone to the emergency room with pain that wouldn't stop. The doctors had done surgery, taken out what they could, started him on chemotherapy. The prognosis wasn't good, but it wasn't hopeless either. He had a chance. Maybe a year. Maybe 2 if the treatment worked. Maybe more if he was lucky. I asked him why he hadn't kept trying to reach me after Sarah said she'd pass along the messages. He said he'd believed her. He said she'd seemed concerned, even offered to help if there was anything he needed. He said he'd assumed I was just too busy to call back, that military operations didn't leave room for family emergencies. He said he understood, or thought he did. I asked him for the dates. Every time he'd called, every message he'd left, he had them written down in a notebook, the kind of careful record-keeping that came from years of working as an accountant. August 14th, August 28th, September 10th, September 24th, October 8th, October 29th, November 12th. 12 calls over 4 months. 12 messages that never reached me. Linda came back into the room and sat down next to my father. She'd been crying. I could see it in the redness around her eyes. But her voice was steady when she spoke. She said they'd talked about flying out to see me. thought maybe if they showed up in person, someone would have to let them through. But the cancer had made traveling impossible. The chemotherapy had left my father too weak, too sick to handle airports and long flights. She said Sarah had called twice during those months. Once in September to say I was doing well, that the deployment was going smoothly, that I'd be home for Christmas. Once in November to ask if they needed anything, if there was any way she could help. Both times, Sarah had been warm and friendly, and completely convincing. Both times, Linda had hung up thinking that at least my father's son had married a good woman, someone who cared. I sat there on that couch and tried to understand what kind of person does this. Not the leaving. People leave marriages all the time, for all kinds of reasons, some of them good. But this was different. This was watching someone reach out for help and deliberately cutting the line. This was letting a man with cancer believe his son didn't care enough to call. My father must have seen something in my face because he leaned forward and put his hand on my knee. He said it wasn't my fault. He said I couldn't have known. He said the important thing was that I was here now, that we had time. But I could hear the strain in his voice, the exhaustion that came from months of wondering why his son had gone silent at the moment when it mattered most. I spent the rest of the morning learning about treatment schedules and medication names and the logistics of managing a terminal illness. Linda had taken time off from her job as a school administrator. They'd rearranged the house to make things easier, moved a bed into the downstairs office so my father wouldn't have to climb stairs. The refrigerator was full of the kind of food you eat when nothing tastes right anymore. The bathroom cabinet held enough prescription bottles to stock a pharmacy. Before I left, I asked my father if Sarah had ever seemed uncomfortable when he'd called the house. He thought about it for a moment, and then shook his head. He said she'd always been pleasant, always promised to have me call back soon. He said she'd asked about his health once early on, and he'd told her about the diagnosis. He said she'd sounded genuinely sorry to hear it. I drove home through streets that had started to fill with holiday shoppers and families taking their children to see Santa Claus at the mall. The world looked normal, cheerful even, and I felt like I was watching it from behind glass. I thought about Sarah sitting in our kitchen, hanging up the phone after talking to my father, going about her day as if she hadn't just committed an act of casual cruelty. I thought about her leaving that note on the counter, claiming she needed time to think, never mentioning that she'd spent 4 months blocking the one communication that mattered most. When I got back to the house, there were 3 messages on my phone. One from my unit, checking on my leave status. One from a friend I'd deployed with, wanting to meet for drinks. One from Sarah's mother, asking if I'd heard from her daughter. I deleted all 3 without responding. I had things to do now, plans to make. Because if Sarah wanted time to think, I was going to make sure she had all the time in the world to think about what she'd done. I spent the next 2 days building a case. Not the kind you take to court, though later it might come to that. The kind you build when you need to understand exactly what happened, and make sure everyone else understands it too. I went through the phone bills first. We had a shared account, everything itemized online, going back 2 years. I downloaded every statement and started matching numbers to names. My father's calls showed up exactly when he said they did. August 14th at 2 in the afternoon, duration 7 minutes. August 28th at 10 in the morning, duration 12 minutes. September 10th at 4 in the afternoon, duration 8 minutes. All of them to our home landline, the number we'd kept even though most people called our cells now. Sarah had answered every single one. I cross-referenced the dates with my email. I'd sent Sarah 43 messages during the deployment, most of them short updates about my schedule and questions about how things were going at home. She'd replied to 38 of them. None of her replies mentioned my father. None of them mentioned cancer. None of them suggested anything was wrong with anyone except her. And even then, her complaints had been vague. She was tired. Work was stressful. She missed me, but she understood I had important things to do. I found the emails she'd sent to my unit in September. I'd given her the contact information months earlier, told her it was for emergencies, real emergencies, the kind where she absolutely had to reach me and couldn't wait for a regular call. She'd used it once. September 18th. Subject line: quick question about mail. She'd wanted to know if I needed her to forward a package from one of my army buddies. Nothing about my father. Nothing urgent. I checked her social media accounts next. We'd never been the kind of couple who posted much, but she'd been more active during the deployment than I'd realized. Photos of herself at the farmer's market, updates about her yoga classes, links to articles about mindfulness and self-care and finding yourself. In October, she'd posted about the importance of setting boundaries with toxic people. In November, she'd shared something about how you can't pour from an empty cup. Her friends had left encouraging comments. Everyone seemed to think she was going through something difficult. I went through our bank statements. She'd spent money normally for the first few months of the deployment. Groceries, gas, the regular bills. But starting in September, there were changes. More restaurant charges, shopping trips to stores we'd never been able to afford before. A weekend in Seattle in October that she'd never mentioned. The yoga studio where she taught had paid her the same amount every month, so it wasn't like she'd gotten a raise. The money was coming from somewhere. I called the studio. The owner, a woman named Patricia who'd always seemed to like me, answered on the third ring. I told her I was home on leave and wanted to surprise Sarah with dinner. I asked if she knew what days Sarah would be teaching this week. There was a pause, and then Patricia said something that confirmed what I'd already started to suspect. She said Sarah hadn't taught a class since September. She'd resigned, actually, said she needed to focus on other things. Patricia had been sorry to see her go. I asked if Sarah had mentioned what those other things were. Patricia hesitated, then said she probably shouldn't say anything. I told her I appreciated her loyalty, but I also told her I'd been overseas for 11 months, and I was starting to realize I didn't know what had been happening at home. She sighed. She said Sarah had mentioned a friend, someone who'd been helping her through a difficult time, someone she'd been spending a lot of time with. Patricia said she'd assumed it was just a friend, someone Sarah had needed while I was gone. But looking back, maybe it had been something else. I thanked her and hung up. I sat at the kitchen table with all the evidence spread out in front of me. Phone records, emails, bank statements, social media posts. The pattern was clear. Sarah had started pulling away in September, right around the time my father's second call. She'd quit her job. She'd started spending money we didn't have. She'd begun building a life that didn't include me, all while continuing to send emails that suggested everything was fine. But none of that explained why she'd kept my father's calls from me. That was the piece that didn't fit. She could have left me and I would have been hurt. But I would have understood. People change. Marriages end. It happens. But actively preventing me from knowing that my father had cancer, deliberately blocking those calls while making him believe I'd gotten the messages, that was something different. That was cruelty for its own sake. I called Linda that evening. I asked her if she'd mind doing something for me. I asked her to call Sarah's mother and mention casually that I'd been by to see my father. I asked her to mention the cancer. I asked her to see what happened. Linda said she'd do it. She said she'd call me back. 2 hours later, my phone rang. It was Sarah's mother, Margaret. Her voice was shaking when she asked me why she'd had to hear about my father's diagnosis from Linda, instead of from me or Sarah. She said she'd called Sarah immediately, and Sarah had claimed she didn't know anything about it. She said Sarah had seemed genuinely shocked, even said she'd tried to reach my father several times but never got through. I let Margaret talk. I let her defend her daughter. And then I told her about the phone records. I told her about the 12 calls, the exact dates and times, the duration of each conversation. I told her about the emails my father had sent, the voicemails he'd left. I told her about Sarah's resignation from the yoga studio and the money she'd been spending and the weekend in Seattle. I told her everything. The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long I thought she'd hung up. Then she said something I'll never forget. She said she'd known something was wrong. She said Sarah had been different these past few months, distracted and secretive in ways that weren't like her. She said she'd asked Sarah about it once and Sarah had blamed me, said the deployment had been harder than she'd expected, that she felt abandoned. Margaret had believed her because that's what mothers do. They believe their children. But now Margaret was starting to see a different picture. She asked me what I was going to do. I told her I didn't know yet. I told her I needed to talk to Sarah first, needed to hear her explain why she'd done what she'd done. Margaret said she'd try to reach her daughter. She said she'd tell Sarah it was time to come home and face this. I thanked her and hung up. That night, I printed everything. Every phone record, every email, every bank statement, every social media post. I organized it chronologically in a binder with labeled tabs and a table of contents. I made copies and gave one to Linda, told her to keep it somewhere safe. I sent a digital version to my own email and to my lawyer's email, the one we'd used when we bought the house. I wasn't planning to use any of it yet, but I wanted it ready. I wanted everyone to see exactly what had happened, because the truth matters. Even when it's ugly. Even when it hurts. The truth matters because it's the only thing that separates what actually happened from the story people want to believe. And I was done letting Sarah control the story. Sarah came home on December 23rd. Her mother must have convinced her, or maybe Sarah had finally realized she couldn't hide forever. I was sitting at the kitchen table when I heard her car pull into the driveway. The sound of the engine cutting off. The car door closing. Her footsteps on the porch. The key turning in the lock. She walked in carrying a small suitcase. The same one she'd taken on our honeymoon to the coast. She looked good. Rested. Her hair was different, shorter than I remembered, and she was wearing clothes I'd never seen before. She saw me at the table and stopped. For a moment, neither of us said anything. She said my name like a question. Daniel. Then she set down the suitcase and started to say something about being glad I was home safe, but I held up my hand and she stopped. I told her to sit down. She hesitated, then pulled out the chair across from me. The binder was on the table between us, closed. I asked her if she knew why I'd asked her to come home. She said her mother had mentioned something about my father, said he was sick. She said she was sorry to hear that, asked if there was anything she could do to help. Her voice was calm, concerned even. She was good at this. She'd always been good at making herself sound reasonable. I opened the binder. I turned it around so she could see the first page. Phone records from August 14th. My father's number, our home number, the duration of the call. I watched her face as she looked at it. She didn't react, not at first. Then something shifted in her expression, something small but unmistakable. Recognition, maybe. Or calculation. I asked her if she remembered that call. She said she didn't. I flipped to the next page. August 28th. Then the next page. September 10th. I went through all 12 calls one by one, letting her see the dates and times and the undeniable fact that she'd answered every single one. When I finished, she still hadn't said anything. I told her what my father had said. That he'd been trying to reach me. That he'd been diagnosed with cancer in August. That he'd called the house a dozen times asking Sarah to pass along a message. That she'd promised every time to let me know. And that I'd never received a single message. I asked her why. She said she'd forgotten. She said she'd meant to tell me, but things had been stressful, and it had slipped her mind. She said she was sorry. The apology sounded practiced, like something she'd rehearsed on the drive over. I flipped to another section of the binder. The emails I'd sent her. The replies she'd written. I pointed to one from mid-September, where I'd asked specifically if everything was okay at home, if there was anything I should know about. Her reply had been 3 sentences long. Everything's fine. Missing you. Can't wait for you to be home. I asked her if she'd forgotten then, too. She looked at the page and then looked away. She said it wasn't like that. She said I wouldn't understand. I told her to make me understand. She said she'd been angry. She said the deployment had been harder than she'd expected, that she'd felt abandoned, that every day was a reminder I'd chosen the army over her. She said when my father called, she'd thought about telling me, but she'd also thought about how unfair it was, that everyone always expected her to be the strong one, to hold everything together while I was off doing whatever I wanted. She said she'd convinced herself it could wait, that my father's situation wasn't that urgent, that I'd find out eventually and it wouldn't matter that I'd missed a few weeks. I asked her if she'd known it was cancer. She said she had. I asked her if she'd known my father was trying to reach me specifically because it was serious. She nodded. I asked her if she'd understood that, by not telling me, she was making him think I didn't care. She didn't answer. I flipped to the bank statements, the restaurant charges, the shopping trips, the weekend in Seattle. I asked her where the money had come from. She said she'd been working extra hours at the studio. I told her Patricia had said she quit in September. Sarah's face went pale. She started to say something, stopped, then tried again. She said she'd found other work. Freelance teaching, private clients. I asked her for names. She said she didn't have to explain herself to me. I reminded her that we had joint bank accounts, that the money she'd been spending was half mine, that I had every right to know where it came from. She stood up. She said this was exactly why she'd needed space, because I was controlling and demanding and I never trusted her. She said she'd made a mistake not telling me about my father, but I'd made plenty of mistakes too, and if I couldn't forgive her, then maybe we didn't have a marriage worth saving. I stayed seated. I told her she was right about one thing. We didn't have a marriage worth saving. But not because I couldn't forgive her. Because what she'd done wasn't a mistake. Mistakes are things that happen when you're trying to do the right thing and you fail. What she'd done was a choice. She'd chosen not to tell me my father had cancer. She'd chosen to let him think I didn't care. She'd chosen to spend 4 months building a new life while I was overseas, trusting her to take care of things at home. I told her I'd already contacted a lawyer. I told her I had copies of everything in the binder, that I'd given them to my father's wife and my attorney, and sent them to my own email where they'd be waiting if I needed them. I told her I didn't know yet what I was going to do with all this information, but I wanted her to know it existed. I wanted her to understand that the story she'd been telling herself, and everyone else, wasn't the only story anymore. She asked me what I wanted from her. I told her I wanted her out of the house by the end of the week. I told her she could take her things, the furniture she'd bought, anything that was clearly hers, but the rest was staying here. I told her we'd divide everything else fairly. But fair didn't mean equal, and it definitely didn't mean she got to walk away without consequences. She said I was being vindictive. She said I was punishing her for being human. She said I'd never loved her the way she'd needed to be loved. Maybe she was right about that last part, but I'd been faithful. I'd been honest. I'd kept my promises. And when she'd been given the chance to do the same, she'd chosen something else. She picked up her suitcase and walked toward the bedroom. I stayed at the table. I heard her opening drawers, moving hangers in the closet. I heard her crying, but I didn't go to her. After about an hour, she came back out with 2 suitcases and a box of photographs. She looked at me one more time. She said she hoped I'd be happy. I didn't respond. She left. The house was quiet after she drove away. I sat there for a long time, looking at the binder, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. I thought about my father, about Linda, about all the people who'd been hurt by Sarah's decisions. I thought about the wedding we'd had 8 years ago, the promises we'd made, the future we'd imagined. None of it mattered now. What mattered was what happened next. Christmas came on a Sunday that year. I spent it with my father and Linda. We exchanged gifts, ate a meal Linda had spent 2 days preparing, watched old movies on television. My father looked tired but content. He said having me there made the holiday feel right in a way it hadn't in a long time. I told him I'd be around more now. I meant it. The divorce took 6 months. Sarah hired a lawyer who tried to argue that she deserved half of everything because Washington was a community property state. My lawyer presented the binder, the phone records, the bank statements showing money she couldn't account for, the resignation from her job that she'd never mentioned, the pattern of deception that had characterized the last 4 months of our marriage. Sarah's lawyer suggested we settle quietly. He said going to trial would be expensive and painful for everyone involved. He said his client was willing to accept a smaller settlement in exchange for both parties agreeing not to discuss the details publicly. My lawyer looked at me. I shook my head. I said we'd see them in court. The trial lasted 3 days. Sarah testified that she'd been under enormous stress during my deployment. She said she'd made mistakes, but they were understandable given the circumstances. She said I'd been emotionally distant for years, that the marriage had been failing long before I left for Afghanistan. Her friends testified on her behalf. They talked about how hard it had been for her, how alone she'd felt, how much she'd struggled. Then my father testified. He walked slowly to the stand, his body weakened by months of chemotherapy, and he told the court about the phone calls. He told them about calling my house 12 times, about speaking to my wife each time, about being promised that I'd call back. He told them about wondering why his son had gone silent during the most difficult period of his life. He told them about the relief he'd felt when I'd finally shown up at his door, and the heartbreak he'd felt when he'd realized I'd never known he was sick. Linda testified too. She talked about the messages she'd received from Sarah, the offers to help, the assurances that everything was being handled. She talked about believing that her stepson knew what was happening and had simply been too busy to visit. She talked about the guilt she'd felt for thinking poorly of me, for assuming I was the kind of person who'd abandon his father when it mattered. The judge listened to everything. When it was time for closing arguments, Sarah's lawyer talked about the pressures of military marriages, about how easy it is for communication to break down, about how his client had made errors in judgment but hadn't committed any crime. My lawyer talked about duty and honor and what it means to keep a promise. He talked about the kind of person who blocks 12 phone calls from a man with cancer and then claims she forgot. The judge ruled in my favor. The house stayed with me. The debt Sarah had accumulated during the deployment was her responsibility. She got her car, her personal belongings, and a small portion of our savings. The judge noted in his written opinion that while the state recognized community property, he also recognized that Sarah's actions during the deployment constituted a breach of the mutual trust required for such a division to be fair. Sarah moved to Portland after the divorce was finalized. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd started teaching yoga again, that she'd joined a meditation group, that she was working on herself. I didn't wish her ill. I didn't wish her anything. She'd become someone I used to know, someone whose choices had taken her in a direction I couldn't follow. My father's cancer went into remission 6 months after the trial. The doctors said it was rare, but not impossible. Linda said it was a miracle. I said it was stubbornness. He laughed and said maybe it was all three. He started going to his grandchildren's baseball games again. He and Linda took a trip to Arizona to visit her sister. He looked like himself again, or close enough. I stayed in the house. I kept my job with the Rangers, though I requested assignment to a training unit that wouldn't require overseas deployments. I wanted to be close to my father, wanted to be there if the cancer came back. I started dating someone in the spring, a teacher at Linda's school who liked hiking and didn't mind that I was quiet sometimes. It didn't last, but it felt good to try. People ask me sometimes if I regret how I handled things with Sarah. They think maybe I should have been more forgiving, more understanding. They say everyone makes mistakes, that marriages are complicated, that I could have tried harder to work things out. I listen to them, and I don't argue. But I also don't agree. Because there's a difference between making a mistake and making a choice. Sarah didn't accidentally forget to tell me my father had cancer. She didn't mistakenly answer 12 phone calls and then lose track of what she'd promised. She made a series of deliberate decisions over 4 months, and each decision reinforced the one before it. She chose her comfort over my father's health. She chose her narrative over my right to know what was happening at home. She chose herself, consistently and without apparent regret, until she couldn't anymore. I learned something during that deployment and in the months that followed. I learned that honor isn't something you talk about. It's something you do, especially when no one's watching. It's answering a phone call from a scared man and passing along the message even when you're angry at his son. It's keeping your promises even when breaking them would be easier. It's showing up when people need you, not because you'll get credit for it, but because it's the right thing to do. Sarah didn't do those things. And when I came home and discovered what she'd done, I had a choice too. I could have let it go. I could have accepted her apologies and her explanations and moved forward as if nothing had happened. But that would have required me to pretend that her choices didn't matter, that my father's suffering didn't matter, that honor and duty and keeping your word were just abstract concepts with no real meaning. So I didn't let it go. I documented everything. I presented the evidence. I let the truth speak for itself. And when people ask me if I regret it, I tell them no, because some things shouldn't be forgiven. Not because forgiveness isn't possible, but because some actions reveal something fundamental about a person's character. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. I spent Christmas Eve that year, 1 year after I'd come home to an empty house, at my father's place again. We had dinner, exchanged gifts, talked about his latest doctor's appointment. The cancer was still in remission. The prognosis was good. He looked healthy, strong even, nothing like the gray and exhausted man I'd found sitting in his recliner that December morning. Before I left, he pulled me aside. He said he'd been thinking about everything that had happened, about Sarah and the divorce and the choices we'd both made. He said he was proud of me. Not because I'd won in court, not because I'd gotten the house, or because Sarah had moved away, but because when I'd been given a choice between convenience and integrity, I'd chosen integrity. He said that mattered more than most people realized. I told him I'd learned it from him. From watching him keep his promises even when they were hard. From seeing him show up for people who needed him. From understanding that honor isn't about grand gestures. It's about the small decisions you make every day, the ones nobody sees but everybody feels. He smiled. He said maybe that was true. He said maybe we'd both done okay. I drove home that night through streets decorated with lights and wreaths and all the symbols of a holiday built around homecoming and family. The radio was playing Christmas music again, the same songs I'd turned off a year earlier. This time I left it on. The world still looked normal, but I felt like I was part of it now instead of watching from behind glass. I'd been tested in ways I'd never expected, not by combat or deployment, but by the slow discovery of who the people around me really were when it mattered most. I'd learned that betrayal isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, almost polite. It's a phone call answered and never mentioned. It's a promise made and quietly broken. It's choosing comfort over truth and hoping no one notices. And I'd learned that justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's just about making sure everyone understands what actually happened, stripping away the excuses and explanations, and forcing people to see the truth in daylight. When I got home, I walked through the house that was mine now, really mine, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly, not satisfaction, but peace. The kind that comes from knowing you did what needed to be done, that you held the line when it would have been easier to let it break. I'd come home for Christmas believing my wife would be there. She wasn't. But I'd found something else instead. I'd found out who I was when everything I'd believed in was put to the test. And I could live with that. The empty house didn't feel empty anymore. It felt clean, ready for whatever came next. And that was enough.